Well, Anoop, thank you for a presentation that was both comprehensive and admirably succinct and focused. That was excellent. Lots of ways we could go. Let me start with kind of a big macro question. You mentioned the exchange rates as a topic of interest, and the U.S. and China had its strategic and economic dialogue earlier this week. I happened to be able to attend a small dinner with Vice Premier Wang Qishan Tuesday night to talk about it in a private setting. And I made the simple and I think obvious point, which is also reflected in your numbers, but maybe to elaborate a little bit, that China and its Asian partners have inflation as the major policy concern right now. Here in the US, and to some extent in Western Europe, unemployment is the major policy concern. So this is the perfect time for the exchange rate realignment to take place. We all know the RMB and other Asian currencies must over time go up a lot, and from a cyclical standpoint, this is the ideal time from the standpoint of the surplus and the deficit countries for it to happen. You had some numbers up there about how much the exchange rates have changed, but why don't you elaborate on that a little bit, partly because there is some confusion. The RMB has gone up a bit over the last 6 months against the dollar, but not really much, I think, on a trade-weighted basis. Why don't you elaborate on that a little bit and tell us how you see the prospects?
All right, well, thanks very much. On the currency issue, let me start with China. What are the facts? As you know very well, last June, they introduced a new kind of flexibility in the exchange rate system. And if you look at the period since then, in nominal terms, US dollar related, there has been appreciation of over 5% in nominal terms. Now again, if we look at the last 6 months, we probably find that this 5% appreciation has occurred over the last 6 months. So if you were then to look at this last 6 months on an annual basis, and then take account of the higher inflation, you probably see significant appreciation taking place. But let me, Fred, move just for a second away from the actual numbers. I was in Asia last week, and this issue comes up a lot. We also gave a presentation at the Asian Development Bank meeting with the ADB on does Asia need a new engine of growth? I think it is becoming clear that not only because of its impact on growth, but also for social stability reasons, Asia does want to develop a new engine of growth, raising household consumption in China, but also making sure investment, infrastructure investment takes place. I think there is much greater recognition now that exchange rate flexibility and appreciation has to be part of this, especially where household consumption has to rise. So I think the way Asians see this is, they see now the importance of a package, including in China. They talk about this openly, and they mention frequently that exchange rate flexibility and more precisely appreciation has to be part of the package and will be part of the package. So my own sense is that the recognition that this is needed is now publicly acknowledged in Asia. And we are seeing appreciation taking place. So I think, Fred, my reaction is the recognition that this is needed is growing. The next step is to make it happen.
Right, and in that context, just to push it a little further, you mentioned quite rightly that the RMB has gone up in nominal terms against the dollar by 5% or so last 6 months, add a couple of points for the inflation differentials, and that's significant. But I think it's correct that the RMB has not gone up on a trade-weighted, real effective basis, and presumably that's what counts in terms of the effort to counter inflation. So we, at least here at the Institute, and when I was discussing it with Chinese the other night, stressed the need for the real effective rate to go up, since that's what will have an effect across their economy. What do you find in your talks with them? Do they still focus on the dollar rate, or do they recognize that the real effective rate is what really counts in terms of impact across the economy, including the current account, but maybe more importantly to them, the things you mentioned, helping to quell the inflation pressures?
Yeah. Well, we are going to be going back to China in the coming weeks to do the next Article 4, which is an important step. So we will be having more sustained discussions with senior authorities just a few weeks from now. I think we will know more at that stage. My sense is that the problem is recognized. Whether they focus on nominal or real effective, we have to see what they now believe. So far, my sense is that their focus has been on the nominal change relative to the US dollar. That has been where they have been. They have also at the same time emphasized to us that they don't believe their current account surpluses are going to go back up the way that we currently project them to, and certainly not going to go back anywhere they were some years ago. So I think they recognize that it is not going to, and it should not. I think the recognition that appreciation is part of the package is there. We have to see now how they quantify this. They don't want to project it. But Fred, we will know more in a few weeks. My sense is the recognition for it is much more than 12 months ago. Higher inflation is a problem, not just in China, in other countries. And they do see that exchange rate policy is part of the macroeconomic policy mix to keep inflation at the target range.
Just one other question on this. As I've had recent discussions with Chinese friends, I also get the sense there's another change in thinking within China, that there's now quite an active debate and a lot of criticism of the buildup of such a huge level of foreign exchange reserves. And a widespread view growing in China that they're simply wasting a lot of the national patrimony by putting so much of it into foreign exchange reserves, particularly invested, as most of it is, in such unremunerative investments whose capital value is likely to decline over time. So, but have you picked up a view of that type that would also presumably point them in the direction of permitting more flexibility in the currency policy?
Well, as you said, the People's Bank governor has made this specific statement just a few weeks ago. It's an important step, he said that. The way I would answer that is come back to a point I've made earlier. They seem really very committed to a packet of policies that will prevent the current account surplus going back up where it's been and where they believe we think it will. Our projections still have, on current policies, surpluses going back up, but they seem to be quite seriously committed to telling us that's not going to happen because our policies are going to ensure it does not happen. And that's quite a step.
Well, we wish you success in the Article 4 talks, and we hope that their processing will not be as delayed this time as they were the last time around.
Well, we are certainly planning a very quick Article 4 for a number of countries in the next 2 months, 6 weeks.
Let me just shift to one other topic you raised, then we'll open it up. You talked a bit about China's increasing role as a foreign investor in the region and what more widely, and the flow of capital within the region. We had a session like this a few weeks ago with friends from the Asian Development Bank who were emphasizing the initiative in the region to develop region-wide capital markets. And their analysis suggested that there was an increase in national capital markets, including bond markets, in some of the Asian countries, but that most of the external finance still came from global markets, particularly in the advanced countries, and there was not yet much development of regional financial markets in Asia. A, do you share that analysis? B, do you think that's an important issue in the further evolution of regional economic cooperation, regional integration of the Asian economies?
I think, Fred, that's actually a very important point. which is only recently getting a lot of attention. Now, why do I say that? There is a lot more emphasis in Asia, especially in the ASEAN Plus 3, on integration in Asia. However, they accept that if you look at trade, we all like to believe that Asia is quite integrated. And if you look at trade flows within Asia, it's grown a lot in the last 10 years, right? So it means that Asia is integrating on the trade side quite well. Well, the answer is no, it's not. And the reason why is, if you look at the increase in trade in Asia the last 10 years, it's a lot. But it's not because of demand within Asia. It's all the same processing trade for meeting final demand outside Asia. So there is importance now that we need to increase demand within Asia. But then as you look at financial integration within Asia, it's even less for the reason you've said. If you look at who's holding these bonds and other financial assets, it's being held by creditors outside Asia. So there's very little financial integration within Asia. And I think this is also now getting recognized as part of the whole package of medium-term policies that Asia needs financial innovation. It has a bank-dominated financial system that has held out against the global crisis. But if you look at how Asia is going to finance the infrastructure and other sectors that need over the medium term, it's not going to happen within Asia unless there is financial innovation, a much greater development of financial markets and capital markets. So I would say Asia wants to integrate. On trade, it looks good, but it's not as good as it looks. And on the financial side, it really is not much. And I think that recognition is also growing. And you will see financial innovation and policies being part of policies that the leaders want to achieve over the next few years. But this has been quite recent in recognizing that there is not much integration on the financial side.
Okay, interesting. Okay, floor is open, and question from the back to start. Please introduce yourself, tell us who you are, where you're from, and then fire away.
Ian Talley, Dow Jones. A few weeks ago, Iwan Aziz said that he expected that at least Eastern Asia could produce a plaza-like accord to appreciate their currencies together, given the deficit that China has with many of its trade partners there. I'm wondering if you share that optimism on that, and whether you also discount the possibility of a regional currency. And secondly, you talked about the need for inflation to deal, currency appreciation to deal with inflation. There is currency appreciation being done at a nominal rate, as you pointed out, in China, but I'm wondering if you think faster appreciation in both nominal and real effective rates are needed to deal with, to really tackle inflation in China.
Well, there's certainly been some discussion of regional currency. I don't think it reached a stage where people believe it's going to happen in the near term, but it is something which is being talked about. I think we are seeing a much greater discussion in the region about extreme rate policy, why it is needed. I think there will be collaboration. It's very difficult to know or to project what happens in the near term, but I think surveillance in Asia is growing. You know that the ASEAN Plus 3 group has now established a surveillance unit called AMRO based in Singapore. They've established the head of the unit over the next 3 years. Japan and China will lead it. And I think we can expect that these issues are going to be discussed much more within Asia than perhaps they have been in the past. On the issue of how much appreciation is needed, I think there is recognition it needs to happen. It's very difficult for anyone to come and tell you what's going to happen in Asia as a whole. It's going to be quite different country by country. Countries have appreciated, they have tightened policies. So how this works out, we have to look country by country. And it's very difficult to make a view, to take a view for the region as a whole in one number.
I know Randy Henning's working on that regional surveillance issue and going to visit AMRO soon, I think. So let me turn to him for the next question in logical sequence. Then we'll come back and come up here.
Yeah, thank you. Randy Henning at the Institute and at American University. I did, in fact, Fred read my mind, I did, in fact, want to ask about AMRO, now that it is kind of founded and about to be up and running in Singapore, with the mandate to conduct surveillance for ASEAN Plus 3. This is an area, of course, in which the International Monetary Fund has a lot of experience, and your department in particular. AMRO, one might say, has some comparative advantages in a couple of areas. It's based within the region. It could conduct surveillance a little bit more frequently, perhaps, than only once a year. But I think that there is grounds for cooperation between the fund and AMRO on the basis of their relative strengths. I'd ask you, I'm curious as to what your advice would be to AMRO now as they go about setting up their surveillance mechanism, kind of conducting their analysis and publicizing their results. On the basis of your experience at the fund, what would you recommend to them?
All right. Well, for all those, I'm sure you all know Randy's work, but for people who don't, I'm sure you all do. I think there's no one who's done more work on the importance of regional arrangements in Asia, and you've looked very carefully over the years on Chiang Mai, and I've, as you know, enjoyed reading your work a lot, and I think what you do now in the next few months is going to be very important. I hope you go and visit them. And I think this is a very important stage for the ASEAN Plus 3. If you look at the number of countries involved, there are at least 13. The 10 ASEAN plus the 3 is an important share of Asia. They have established this surveillance unit, the AMRO. They have established who will lead this in the next 1 year and the next 2. We can expect in the coming months them to establish a working force to start doing surveillance. I obviously don't want to sound prescriptive in the IMF or I personally giving a view as to what they should do, partly because it would not be diplomatic for me to be seen as being prescriptive. I can say that the region knows very well what they need to do. I think there is no doubt that they will look at how to manage the next phase of growth, how to control overheating. And there's a lot of discussion, as I mentioned earlier, on the package of policies needed to develop a new engine of growth, the rebalancing of policies. I'm sure they will turn to that. And we know that many countries in ASEAN have now publicly made the statement that they do want greater cooperation with international financial institutions on financing issues. My own sense is that we are at a new stage. I think we are not at a stage where the stigma of the Asian crisis holds them back. You've seen leaders in Asia looking at what needs to be done, and I think you will see much more collaboration on the financing side too. So I do think this is an important step. It's very important that we not be prescriptive in what they should do, but we are certainly in a position where we would like to help if we can, be consultative, and I think we can expect this to be a very important development in Asia's economic cooperation in coming years, that we do now have an important new surveillance unit.
Question to the back.
Hugo Noré with Agence France Presse. I have a question on Japan. In January, you wrote a commentary saying that the Japanese financial system should have a more risky profile. Since then, there have been these tragic events of the earthquake, and the financial system has shown its remarkable resilience. I wondered why you wanted to shake up that, why you wanted for example, households to have less precautionary savings, whereas the Japanese government is still financing at the lowest rate in the world because of this huge amount of reserves that it can tap into. it doesn't need external financing. Why shake of that? Can you explain in a few words?
Well, I think we're at a stage now where the focus is on the next 9 months and having reconstruction spending move ahead. I think that really is the most important. We know the government has already passed the first budget to do it. They are expected to pass a second supplementary budget in the next 1 or 2 months. I think the focus is to build up reconstruction spending. Now, on the financial side, I think what you are talking about is what we've said in the past. I think in Japan, as well as other countries in Asia, a financial innovation in a way that gives access to small and medium-scale enterprises, especially in the non-tradable goods sector, is an important objective. This is a concern not just in Japan, but other countries too, that you see the bank-based financial system, which does very well in financing the tradable goods sector. If you look at the service sector and the small and medium-scale enterprises, the access is not that much, and including in some countries on the household side. So I would say that is part of the overall package of financial innovation that many parts of Asia, including Japan, need to achieve in the coming years.
Question up here at the head table.
Teresa Terminacian, formerly from the IMF. Anoop, I would like to know if the Asian countries, in particular China, really are not prepared significantly to increase or speed up appreciation, and at the same time want to control a sort of inflation through a combination of macro policies, tightening, macroprudential, tightening fiscal, tightening maybe further monetary policy and so on. First of all, do you think that this will be effective and desirable from their point of view? And then, sort of, what would be the implications of this for the recovery of the world, particularly if at the same time as this happens, some other sort of possible risks, like in Europe, you know, some sort of credit event, or I mean, some problem with the peripheral Europe emerging and, you know, creating problem for the banking system in Europe. How do you see these risks, and what would be the position of the fund in advising Asia in this respect?
Yeah. Well, I think if I reinterpret the second part of your question, it's a question asked by many, and that is, why has Asia been somewhat slower than expected in bringing their policies in line with where they are in terms of their economies? Why has that happened? It's a very interesting point, and I've asked this around. My own sense is that there is a reason why they haven't moved faster to tighten policies. And the reason, in my view, is that many Asian countries, having gone through this global crisis, and through either their stimulus measures or through other external events, they saw the risk that Asia could be affected. And given their concern that there are new external shocks that may emerge, they want to keep their policies accommodative, so were there to be new shocks externally, they would not be affected growth-wise as much. And that is why they have not adjusted macro policy sufficiently, because they've been concerned they're looking at a global economy where there are new shocks coming. Now, I think if that can be taken as a reason why they haven't moved faster, my own sense today is they've moved beyond that. They moved beyond that because inflation in almost every country has gone up higher and faster than anyone expected. It's not just India, but in other countries too. You've seen inflation expectations rise more than any of their leaders expected. So they are now at a stage where they are very concerned about the quality of their growth. They have really elevated the importance of dealing with inflation because they know if you look at the food price effect on the poor, where they don't have sufficient safety nets, it's very important. So I think the inflation concern, its effect on the poor and the effect on stability is now much more elevated in their minds. And therefore, they are much more open to policies that will ensure this. Now, I cannot say how this will trade off with exchange rates, but I do believe that we are now at a stage where this is at the top end of their minds, and therefore they will take policies. And I know leaders have also made that point. If it needs exchange rate flexibility, we will do what it takes. But I think Asia is in a different position today than it was 6 months ago on the importance of macro and other policies that will bring inflation down.
Anoop, just to pursue that, does that have any implications for, and it goes to Teresa's other question, for international cooperation through the G20 or otherwise? Would this make the Asian countries more willing to cooperate in the mutual assessment program of the fund, the effort to get better rebalancing coordination among the G20 countries to try to assure more sustainability for the global recovery?
Well, I think our assumption is that it is happening. The G20 process is moving to the next stage, list of 7 countries that are going to be looked at carefully. My own view is that...
which includes China and India.
It includes China and India. My own view is twofold. In the short run, they are very concerned about inflation, and so they will act. Second, there is much greater recognition today in Asia that this world is really highly connected, and they were almost very severely affected by the global crisis. They don't want this happening again, and therefore I think there is greater recognition that there needs to be international collaboration, because otherwise the risk of there being a problem goes up. Now, we don't know what's going to happen in the next few months, but I would say there is greater recognition that collaboration is needed, or the risk of another crisis for a different source will rise.
Okay, we're getting close to our closing hour, so I've got 3 people lined up in the back and 2 hands. So let's take all 5 questions, and then you can answer them with equal comprehensiveness and succinctness as you did in your presentation. Let's go to the back.
Sanjeev Joshipura from the Commodity Markets Council. Dr. Singh, on a couple of your slides, you mentioned headline inflation and core inflation. Now, food and energy prices make up a larger percentage of the average household budget in a developing economy as compared to in an advanced economy. And obviously, food and energy prices are reflected in headline inflation, but not in core. And so my question for you is headline inflation therefore a more important metric than core inflation in developing economies? Thank you.
Okay, next, back there.
Hi, Milar Sager from the Voice of America. Excellent presentation, by the way, Mr. Singh. Just a couple of APEC-related questions. Given the uneven speed of the recovery, what do you think the prospects are for the APEC proposal for an Asia-Pacific free trade zone? And secondly, as a follow-up question, do you foresee any kind of major policy or trade agreements at the upcoming APEC summit?
I'm Koskito with GG Press, and IMF projection of the Japan's real GDP growth is 1.4%, but it was announced last month, 1 month ago. So, and since then, I think you have many information, and so could you give me an update on your view on Japanese growth?
Thank you. I'm John from Radio Free Asia. Thank you for your presentation. In your presentation, I'd like to ask you the one country, the North Korea. North Korea GDP growth is less than 3% as expected. So I'd like to ask you simple questions. How do you look at the now the North Korea economic situation? And what the impact will be on North Korea among the world inflation and then the food prices are going up. So thank you so much.
Ted Truman.
Ted Truman from the Peterson Institute. Anoop, it's good to see you. Nice presentation, nuanced as always. So I'd be interested in the IMF views, or if you don't have the IMF views, your views on two questions with respect to Japan that have puzzled me. One is that I recently learned that, to my surprise, that there's a great debate in Japan about deflation. This relates to one of these earlier questions here that you had, and the view being, if I understand it correctly, is you need to perpetuate deflation, because as long as you have deflation, then government, the industry and households are not investing, and therefore they will spend their savings on the finance the budget deficit, and that's the only way you can continue to support the large government debt. And to a degree, and there some of it will be forced in the short run. And although you may have a longer run impact on the structure of trade, both within Asia and meaning including with Japan, and on with Asia and the rest of the world, as a aftershock, if you want to call it that, of the crisis. Now, maybe none of this stuff is big enough to amount to anything, which is possible, but I was wondering whether you had any, you and your colleagues had any thoughts on that subject. Thank you.
Okay, last question, Nick Verone.
Yes, thank you very much. Nicolas Veron, visiting fellow here at the Institute and also from Bruegel in Brussels. In your presentation, you mentioned quite prominently the issue of financial integration in Asia. And I guess one of the lessons of the financial crisis in Europe is that the European Union had made this big effort at regional financial integration, particularly since the late 90s. And a lot of it had been about regulatory harmonization, dismantling of barriers. But one lesson from the crisis is that this was not enough. If you want to have sustainable financial integration, you need more centralized policy instruments to manage the financial system, to supervise it, and to manage crisis. And the most clear embodiment of that being the creation of supranational supervisory authorities in Europe for banking, securities, and insurance. So my question is, do you sense this sort of analysis in Asia, the ultimate consequences of financial integration, the fact that if you want to embark on that trip, you will need a very strong political commitment to supranational institution building, and how ready do you sense the Asian leaders you talk to embark on that sort of path? Thank you.
Okay. Just a few questions and across a diverse range of topics.
All right. Fred, thanks very much. Thank you for all the questions. I will try to answer them in some concise way. The North Korea one is very simple. They're not a member of the IMF, so we don't really have any details or facts beyond what we see in the press. There were many questions on Japan. I'll come back to it in a moment. One of the early questions was about core inflation and food and energy, and it's a very important point. Essentially, our concern currently is, as I mentioned earlier, in a number of countries, a core inflation is going up. Now, the problem is that we've done some research in the last few months, looking back the last 10 years, and what we found, which is not surprising, is that in the poor countries, low-income countries, where the share of food in household consumption is much higher, the evidence shows that the entrenchment into core inflation takes place much faster than we had hoped or expected some years back. That in countries, in low-income countries, if there are food price shocks or energy price shocks, they should not be just assumed to be external and exogenous, because the record tells us that they do spill over and they remain entrenched for longer than other economies. And therefore, for countries like India and others, what's going on now is a concern, because what the research tells us is the entrenchment is deeper and longer than we had earlier thought. And there was a question on what APEC will do, and I just don't know what is going to come out of it. I just know that there is much greater interest in Asia on integration, both on the trade side and on the financial side, but I just don't know if APEC will move ahead in the free trade zone. It is already happening in some cases. In various countries, you see that free trade zones within the country is also rising. So I think this is part of the objectives. Now on Japan, we had done a very early prediction right after this crisis that had the growth for 2011 slightly reduced to 1.4, but clearly that is on the high side. We know that last week the Bank of Japan has come up with a projection of 0.6 and is lower in some other market reports. We have, as I mentioned, a team going out to Japan in a couple of weeks, so we are waiting until then to make our own assessment. I think our own assessment is not that important. I think this is a tragedy. There will be a very sharp impact on output in the first 2 quarters, and our interest must be to have the conditions that will bring it back next year. So I think most projections show that the recovery will take place next year, and the growth next year is viewed as well above 2.5%. What our number is, A, I don't think is that important. B, we will have a number in a few weeks. It will probably be a much sharper impact in the next 2 quarters than we had thought a month ago. So we will know about that quite soon. Ted asked a number of questions about Japan and what does deflation mean. And clearly, the kind of projections we had made last year and before the crisis had the policy stance moving Japan away from deflation. And I think that was very important for the kind of recovery and growth that we thought Japan needed. I don't think our views on that are going to change as we look ahead over the next 2 years. In terms of Japan's role regionally and globally, we know, of course, that Japan's share of trade in Asia has already fallen a lot in the last 10 years. And the ripple effects we're now seeing, I think, are very significant in certain components, showing that it does play a role in certain supply chains that are greater than what we thought some time ago. Will this change in the future as enterprises, corporates try to build more contingency steps away from Japan? I don't know. We do know that what we do know about these supply shocks and ripple effects is that most companies in Japan have projected that in the next few months they're going to be back in full production. So my sense is, barring any new shocks, this will not be an issue regionally or globally next year. On financial integration, the last question, I think there is much greater awareness in Asia that a number of policy steps are needed. And I'm not sure whether AMRO will take up this burden, but it is certainly something that Asia wants to do, is to build up greater financial integration. They will look at Europe. We're still a long way away from building up the capital markets and bond markets that Asia does need, and to increasing integration within Asia. I think what you've said is an important issue which AMRO can probably take up. We are doing a number of FSAPs, financial sector assessment programs, and I know this is part of, I think what I will say, Fred, in my conclusion, is that the need for financial innovation to move much deeper and beyond the bank-dominated financial system that Asia has, there is a recognition that needs to happen. And I think this will be probably something that AMRO will begin to look at.
Okay, Anoop, thank you very much for sharing your insights on so many topics. We could go on for a long time, but we've reached our witching hour. Thank you again for being with us. Thanks to the audience for joining us. Meeting adjourned.
Thanks very much.